All right, welcome everyone, and welcome back to Drisha. Today, it's a pleasure to be learning with you all today as we come together again with Rabbi David Silber for on the topic of the covenant of Sinai. The reception of the Torah at Sinai and the episode of the golden calf and its aftermath are formative events for the Jewish people. As we have for this past several weeks, we will be learning with Rabbi David Silber, the dean and founder of Drisha. For this class, if you have a preferred Tanakh or Chumash, please keep it at hand. We will also be sharing sources on screen from Sfaria. And with that, I am going to hand things over to Rabbi Silber.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we're up to chapter 19 of Shemot. And chapter 19 begins the part of the book of Shemot that deals with the reception of the Torah, Kabbalat Torah. Chapter 19 is about the preparations for receiving the Torah. Chapter 20 has the 10 Commandments. At the end of chapter 20, the people say to Moshe, we don't want to hear God directly anymore. We're frightened. And Moshe, that's fine. And Moshe then receives a whole set of laws, beginning with the end of chapter 20, chapter 21, 22, most of chapter 23. And then he comes down in chapter 24, and he tells the people, he tells the people what he's been told, the various laws. He writes it down, he reads it to them, and the people accept this, or the book of the covenant. And that essentially is the description of the Torah, beginning in chapter 19 and running through chapter 24, a description of the reception of the Torah, with the one exception being that Moshe still has to retrieve the tablets of the covenant, Luchot HaBrit, and receive the instructions for building the Mishkan, which begins in chapter 25 and runs through chapter 31. So all of that has to do with receiving divine instruction, 10 commandments, all kinds of additional laws, mishpatim, etc., and the instructions for building the Mishkan. That's chapter 31. And then in chapter 32, as Moshe's about to descend the mountain, everything is perfect. And then we have, of course, the episode of the golden calf, which sets everything back and disrupts what might have been a very beautiful, perfect ending to the book. But that doesn't happen. Of course, we have the golden calf, very central event. And then the Torah describes to us the response to the golden calf. And the book will end on the high note of actually constructing the Mishkan. That's the remainder of the book of Exodus, and actually the second half of the book. We're into the second half of the book, and we start with chapter 19. And the first question that I wanted to address as we start to read chapter 19 is exactly the place in this book of the reception of the Torah. How does the book of Shemot understand this idea, this event of people standing at Sinai and receiving the Torah? So we'll see that, of course, and we've touched upon this in the past, we'll see that this is, of course, it's a very central event. Nobody disputes that. But the question is whether it is the actual goal of the Exodus or not. Then we have a huge dispute that we will touch upon once again. Maybe we'll add a few details there. But let's begin with chapter 19. B'chodesh hashlishi, v'tzeit b'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim, v'yom hazeh bo midbar Sinai, v'yisu me'refidim, v'yavohu midbar Sinai, v'yachalu ba'midbar, v'yichan sham Yisrael neged hahar. Those are the first two verses of chapter 19. On the third month, after the Israelites had gone forth from the land of Egypt, on that very day, they entered the wilderness of Sinai. Having journeyed from Rephidim, they entered the wilderness of Sinai and encamped in the wilderness. Israel encamped there in front of the mountain. These two verses, now remember, we're talking about after leaving Egypt, the people are traveling in the desert. And we've seen this before. They come to Marah, they come to Elim, and Rephidim was mentioned in chapter 17. They come to Rephidim, and that's where they complain that they don't have water. And that's the whole incident of Masa and Riva, etc. So what's interesting over here? So the last place we knew they were is Refidim in chapter 17. And actually, chapter 19 in our chapter, in the second pasuk, Vayisum Refidim Vayavo Midbar Sinai. That is the way the Torah typically describes all of the journeys throughout the desert. They traveled from X and they came to Y. This is consistent throughout the Torah. And because it's consistent throughout the Torah, there's something unusual about the beginning of chapter 19. The very first verse seems completely superfluous. Because we follow the normal pattern of the Torah. There were less Refidim, which was also called Masa and Riva. And the chapter 19 could have begun, Vayisu b'nei Yisrael, Refidim, Vayachanu, Vayavo midbar Sinai. That's what you would expect. But the first verse is B'chodesh hashlishi l'tzeit b'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim b'yom hazeh bo midbar Sinai. And that's a tip-off. On this very day, in the third month, they came to midbar Sinai. Before we have the usual, they traveled from X and they came to Y. So the very first verse highlights, tells the reader, something special is happening here. On this very day, and even the emphasis on the third month, because we know that the number 3, traveling for 3 months or traveling for 3 days, reminds all of us, no doubt, of the story of the binding of Isaac, Akedat Yitzchak. Abraham travels for 3 days, he sees the mountain. So the Torah is highlighting over here in a way that's so easy to miss, but it highlights there are a lot of journeys in the desert. There were 42 stops in the desert. This one is different. By Yom Hazeh, in the third month, at this time, they came to the desert of Sinai, and they encamped before the mountain. So even before we get to verse number 3, which makes it clear something special is going on, the reader already has an expectation, and this is going to be different. Now here, I might as well mention that at this point, here we come to a very basic disagreement. We've come across this in the past on more than one occasion, but it bears repetition. There's a very basic disagreement between 2 great medieval commentators, Rashi on one hand and the Ramban on the other, as to the place, the significance of the receiving of the Torah in Sefer Shemot. There's no disagreement between Rashi and the Ramban that this event is a singular and highly significant event. Nobody disputes that. The dispute is something else. That for Rashi, actually, this is the whole goal. For Rashi, the goal in leaving Mitzrayim is to receive the Torah. That for Rashi is the goal, and he makes this clear on multiple occasions. To the extent, actually, and we'll come across this later, that Rashi makes the claim that the entire episode of the golden calf is not in its right place in the Torah. Because for Rashi, the golden calf is chapter 32. The instructions of building the Mishkan begin in chapter 25. Rashi makes the claim that the Torah is not in chronological order. Rashi makes that claim on multiple occasions, but Rashi says that if not for the golden calf episode, there would be no Mishkan altogether. The entire Mishkan for Rashi was a response to the golden calf. Rashi presumably means the golden calf episode is a demonstration that people need some kind of tangible representation of God. This idea of this abstraction, this God who is not to be seen, who is transcendent, that is not something that people can actually connect to. The people need something tangible to connect to. And in the absence of Moshe, we need something else. Something that's not going to disappear on us, like Moshe, who's after all a human being. We need something tangible, concrete, that we can touch and feel and see. Says Rashi, that's why there's a Mishkan. If not for the golden calf episode, there would be no Mishkan. That's Rashi's position. And Rashi, in terms of the significance of, for Rashi, Torah book of Exodus would have ended in chapter 24, not Sefer Nishma. In the completion, as I said before, introducing the chapter, there's chapter 19 through 24, which is all about receiving the Torah. And according to Rashi, the book of Exodus will be a short book, 24 chapters. That'd be the end of the book. There'd be no Mishkan. So that's what Rashi claims. The Ramban takes strong exception to this. The Ramban rejects this, completely rejects it, and on multiple grounds. On one ground, of course, is the fact that the book of Exodus, the Ramban believes, as do many other commentaries, is essentially in chronological order. There are times where it's not in chronological order, but those are the rare exceptions. But fundamentally, the default is everything is in chronological order. We have the same dispute between Rashi and the Ramban in chapter 18, in the previous chapter. Yisro comes. When did Yisro come? Rashi says Yisro did not come before the receiving of the Torah. Yisro came after the Torah is received. And Rashi had a lot of reasons for Rashi's position. Rashi has a very strong argument that the story of Yitro is actually out of chronological order. The Ramban understands that. The Ramban says, nonetheless, I can interpret it that it is in chronological order. We discussed that. I'm not going through all the details, but that's basically the same dispute. That's an important dispute. For Rashi, the order of the Torah is not chronological. It's more conceptual. It's about ideas. And we discussed this, that for Rashi, the reason that, or one way to understand why the story of Yitro precedes Matan Torah is, the story of Yitro is about ethics, it's about justice. And before you get to the revelation, we need to speak about first justice. First step is being a good person, ethical person. Then we can talk about revelation. But that's the Machloket Rashi and the Ramban. So the Ramban says no. The more important point is the Ramban makes the claim that the goal of the Torah was not only to receive the Torah. Receiving the Torah for the Ramban is a goal, no doubt about that, and it's necessary. It's a necessary goal, but it's not a sufficient goal. The Ramban makes the claim that you can have the whole Torah, you can observe the Torah, and still be a bad person. That's the claim of the Ramban. Naval b'shuta Torah. The Ramban makes that claim, and therefore that cannot be the goal, because it's not sufficient. The goal of the Torah, says the Ramban, can be found in our chapter, in chapter 19, not in verses 1 and 2, but later in chapter 19, when God speaks to Moshe and instructs Moshe to go to the people, and we'll get back to those verses, obviously. But in chapter 19, God said to Moshe, let's find this verse. It is verse number 5, verse number 6, right here. That's continuation, verse number 6. And we'll get back to this in a minute. Vatem tiyuli mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh. Says the Torah, says God said to Moshe that if you observe my covenant, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Priest probably does not mean the way we understand priests, but people that serve. Sometimes the word kohen can mean to serve. And a nation, a kingdom of servants, those that serve God, and a holy nation. A goy kadosh, says the Ramban. That's the goal. 2 words. The goal for the Jewish people in the book of Exodus, and the Ramban thinks beyond, of course, is to be a holy nation. A goy kadoshim tiyu. The goal is kadoshim tiyu. In order to get to kadoshim tiyu, says the Ramban, you need to receive the Torah first. Because the Torah is the first necessary step in being holy, but it's not sufficient. So therefore, receiving the Torah, Mount Sinai can't be the goal, says the Ramban. It's not the goal. The goal is Kadoshim Tiyu. And since the goal is Kadoshim Tiyu, says the Ramban, it's only appropriate that the holy nation, the Goy Kadosh, should build a mikdash. So the mikdash is the place, a place, where the holy people, where Am Kadosh, mikdash, a holy space, where the Am Kadosh can serve God, who is also Kadosh. Kadoshim tiyu ki kadosh ani Hashem, says later in the Torah, I am holy, you should be holy, imitate God. That, says the Ramban, is the goal. Here we have a fundamental, can't be more basic machoket. What is the goal? What is the goal of the human being? What is the goal of the Jew? Rashi says, keep the Torah. Ramban says, be a holy nation. You need the Torah to help you get there. But you got to go beyond. Torah is a minimum, but you got to go beyond. Hey, that's the basic malchoket. I put it out there. And I wanted to add one detail I did not mention, which has to do with the pasuk that we encountered very early in the book, in chapter 3, in the episode of the burning bush. So we all remember that episode of the burning bush, of course, chapter 3. And Moshe is walking. He's a shepherd. He's in the desert with the animals. He's taking care of the flock of his father-in-law. And he comes, where does he come to? He comes to Mount Sinai. Har Elohim Choreva. This is not the first time the Torah speaks of arriving at Mount Sinai. Moshe arrives at Mount Sinai in chapter 3. Har Elohim Choreva, the mountain of God. And he sees in the mountain of God, what does he see? He sees a sneh, a burning bush, sneh. Of course, the word sneh is related to the word Sinai. So Moshe is at Har Sinai with a small flame and represents God's presence. Back in chapter 3, he's a shepherd. And in that episode, Moshe is called to serve the people, to go back to Egypt, and to take the people out of the land of Egypt. And as we all remember, of course, Moshe initially resists the command. Get somebody else. And fundamentally, I can't do what he says. And he gives different reasons. And one of them is he doesn't think the people will actually believe that he's appropriate to lead. He doesn't think that Paro necessarily will accept him either, but he doesn't really think the people are going to believe in him. In the context of chapter 3, Exodus chapter 3, I'll read you one verse. And that is an interesting verse, of course. Chapter 3, Moshe says to God in chapter 3, in verse number 11, Moshe says, Vayom Moshe el Elohim, mi anochi, ki elecha paro, v'chi yotzi et bnei Yisrael miMitzrayim. Says Moshe two things. Who am I? He says. Who am I that I'm going to go to Paro and take the people out of Egypt? In other words, there were two different problems. One is Paro's not going to listen to me, and number two, I'm going to take them out of Egypt. We discussed this at the time, not going over all of this, but I want to say just one thing. God's response. Vayomer, ki yeh imach. God said to Moshe, I'll be with you. Now, the question is, who am I to do it? Don't worry who you are to do it. I'm going to be with you. And then God adds something else, right? If the question is, they're not going to believe you. And this is the sign that I have sent you. This will give you standing, presumably with the people. When you take the nation out of Egypt, you will serve God on this mountain. Okay. Now, what we study in chapter 3, we will go over the question, which is, what kind of sign is this? Moshe said, I'm going to go now to lead the people. And they're going to say, and go to Paro. He's not going to accept me. Why should he? And the people, why would the people accept me? God says, don't worry, I'm going to be with you. I'm going to be with you. Don't worry about that. And there's a sign. Let me give you, you can give the people a sign. What's the sign? That when you come to this mountain, you will serve God. You will serve God. What kind of sign is that? That's later on. I need a sign right now. So there are multiple possible interpretations of what the sign is. One of them is the sign is the burning bush. The sign is the burning bush. That's a sign that in the future, there'll be a similar kind of situation later on. When you stand at Sinai, and it won't be a small fire at Sinai, a small revelation, it'll be a great revelation. But my interest here is not so much that problem. My interest is, what does it mean when you come to this mountain, you will serve God? Tavdu et Elohim al harazeh. Here there are two possible interpretations of what this means. In other words, for the Ramban, basically, the Ramban is saying, the way the Ramban understood the verse is, Moshe's questions were, okay, I'll go to Paro, he'll let them go. He'll let them go. Let's say he lets the people go. But the mission, as you described it, God, in a few verses earlier, was to bring the people into the land. Why will they follow me into the land? Says God, as far as Paro is concerned, I'll give you a sign right now. I'm going to be with you. Don't worry about that. As far as the people are concerned, when you get to this mountain, there'll be a sign, and then they will follow you into the land. That's the way the Ramban understands. It's a very interesting interpretation. But the point I wanted to make is a different point. What does it mean when you come to this place, you will serve God on this mountain? This is a sign. And the point is, there are two possible interpretations. One is, let me tell you something. You're going to take them out of Egypt, and when you come back to this mountain, you will serve God on this mountain. That's a reference to receiving the Torah. It's a reference to Nasa v'Nishma. The people will accept the Torah, and that Torah will make it possible, will enable them to possess a land, and you as the Torah lawgiver will be their leader, and they will follow you into the land. That's one possibility. On this mountain, you worship God, you'll serve God, is a reference to receiving the Torah. That's one possibility. But there's another possibility. That does not refer to receiving the Torah, but refers to the building of the Mishkan. When you come to this mountain, you're going to get instructions about building the Mishkan, and the Mishkan will be a place of avoda, a place of service, a place of worship. And that's what's going to happen later on. You're going to come back to this mountain, Moshe. Let me tell you what the plan over here is. You'll take them out of Egypt, but then there's an important event that will happen that will guide you throughout. And the two possibilities. One is receiving the Torah. The other is building the Mishkan. And here I think we could say that that's precisely what Rashi and the Ramban are disagreeing about. What is this Tavnu et Elohim al Harazeh? Does it refer to receiving the Torah? That's Rashi. Rashi is consistent throughout. That's the goal. And the Ramban is consistent throughout. That's not the ultimate goal. That is a goal. But the ultimate goal is to serve God. Migdash, Mishkan, Kadoshim to you. So this very verse that we encountered a few months ago is related to what we have here in chapter 19 as we about to discuss Matan Torah, Kabbalat Torah, and here, of course, it's very noteworthy, Rashi and the Ramban, especially what the Ramban says about V'atem tiyuli mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh. Okay, before we continue, let me just stop for a moment. If anybody has any comments or questions about what we've said so far, speak up.
No questions in chat as of now.
No questions. Okay.
Well, not in chat at least, but
Okay. No one has anything to say. We will continue. Fine. Let's back to chapter 19. Okay. Let's just continue reading.
chapter 19, verse
3. Verse 3. Umoshe Allah el Elohim. Vayikra elav Hashem min ahar lemar. Kol tomar lebeit Yaakov v'taged livnei Yisrael. Moshe ascended the mount. You see that even the kind of language, it feels different. There's a poetry here. And it's not simple prose. It's more lyric prose. And that you typically have, that's a way that the text is informing us that what's going on over here is something very different, something very special. It's one of the questions. You study a text, how does the text make it clear, like this is really important? You know, when you're talking to somebody, having a conversation, there are ways that we can signal, even without saying it. There are ways in the way we talk to others that we make it clear. I have three things to say to you, but one is really important, right? There's the way the tone, the voice is higher or lower voice, etc. Where we stand in relation to the other person. So what kinds of cues that we have to make it clear? I'm saying a lot of stuff, but this is really important. You know, say, listen carefully. It's really important. And one of the ways that the Torah conveys that is by changing from simple prose to a kind of lyric prose. You have this, for example, in the story of Yaakov and wrestling with this angel. It's a different kind of language, right? Shalcheni ki ola hashachar. There's a mystery to it. Send me for the dawn is breaking. Lo ashalechacha ki berachtani. Mashimecha. Just the whole language and the way it feels different. And that's the way of the Torah telling us this is really a significant, a incredibly important event that changes everything. So over here also, Moshe ascends the mountain. Ko tomar lebeit Yaakov b'taged livnei Yisrael. The parallelism. Say this to the house of Jacob, to the people of Israel. Parallelism is the hallmark of biblical poetry. So it's not simple prose over here. Simple prose would be Emor livnei Yisrael, but it doesn't say that. Ko tamar lebeit Yaakov b'taged livnei Yisrael. The parallelism. So Moshe is ascending the mountain. Now God is going to speak. Atem reitem asher asiti l'Mitzrayim. You have seen what I did in Egypt. V'aso etchem al kanfei nesharim. V'avi etchem elai. Another example, right? Verse number 4. Another example. I have brought you here. I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to me. This metaphor. I brought you on it's a poetic metaphor. It's another way that the text is telling the reader, this is different. This is not another stop in the desert. This is of enormous significance. I bore you on eagle's wings. Whatever that means, whatever the message is, doesn't mean so I quickly brought you here. Doesn't mean the eagle can protect its young. Rashi makes that claim. The eagle carries its young on its back, as it were, because no bird flies higher. All the other birds are afraid to carry their nestlings on their back because a bird will fly above them and snatch them. But the eagle has no fear. The eagle is the transcendent. The eagle is above everything else. Whatever it signifies. Poetry. I bore you on eagle's wings. And now God says, V'ata, and now. Im shamoa tishmu b'koli ushmartem et briti. If you hearken to me, hearken to my voice, you observe my covenant. Ve'yitem li skula mikol ha'amim. You will be a treasure from all the nations. Ki li kol haaretz. The earth is mine. I'm God of the whole world, of everything. But you will have a special relationship. What is that relationship? V'yatem tiyuli mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh. You will be unto me a nation of priests and a holy nation. Ela hadvarim asher tedaber el bnei Yisrael. This is what you should say to all of Israel. Now here, this is rather remarkable speech over here. You feel the poetry, you feel it. And the question is, what exactly is God saying to Moshe? In other words, one of the questions in, I would say, within rabbinic thought and within not just rabbinic thought of the Talmud, but down to our very day, the basic question about the relationship of the Jews to the Torah. Here's the statement we could get into this in great detail. I'm not getting into it in great detail, but there's a famous, the Gemara in Shabbat that many are familiar with, which has the midrashim about the reception of the Torah. And the Gemara has a very famous statement over there, Kofa Aleim Har Kigigit, that God held the mountain over the people. And God said, if you accept the Torah, that's fine. If you don't accept the Torah, this is your burial place. I'm going to drop the mountain on top of you. And the people, of course, there's not much choice whether to accept the Torah or not, and the people accept the Torah. It's a very famous medrash. So what is the medrash actually about? What is that about? And what it's about, it seems, not getting to all the details of it, and one way to understand this event is it's not really a choice. In other words, why do you observe the Torah? Because it's God's will. It's God's will. And therefore, it's not about choice. It's not about making your own decision. You embrace the Torah as something that is imposed upon you from without. There is a within Jewish classical rabbinic thinking, there is some who actually make that a centerpiece of their thinking. For those who study with Rabbi Soloveitchik or Rabbi Lichtenstein, that is central to their thinking. Absolutely central to their thinking. It's not a choice. You don't do it because you choose to do it. It's imposed upon you. The most extreme version of that in modern Jewish philosophy would be the thinking of Shai Leibowitz. That's Nechama Leibowitz's brother, who in Israel is much more famous than Nechama. He took it to an extreme. It's about not because it makes sense, even because it's imposed upon you. That's one path. And then the other path, of course. And the other path points out, I would say, that it's presented as a choice. By the way, even the Gemara in Shabbos, with God holding a mountain over the people's head, the people are still offered a choice. It's not much of a choice, but it is a choice. And over here, it sounds like God's telling Moshe, listen, go back to the people. This is what I'm offering them. And see if they want it or not. So at the end of the day, this is a very different way to understand Torah. It's something that you actually have to accept. You have a choice to accept it or not. God hopes that the people will, in fact, accept it, but it's presented as their choice. That's the first point I wanted to make. It's a very important point in terms of understand classical rabbinic thinking. Jewish philosophy, which comes out of the more traditional world, these two different paths. Now, the question over here is, if you do X, then Y. That's the way it typically works. If X, then Y. What is the X and what is the Y over here? In other words, if you do this, there's a reward. But what is the reward over here? It's a conditional statement, right? If, right? Im shamoa tishmu, if you obey, right? If you keep my covenant, then what? Then what? And here I think there's a purposeful ambiguity over here as to what the what is. You will be a nation of priests and a holy nation. Is that part of the condition? Or is that the benefit that you'll get if you keep the covenant? And I would say it's actually both. In other words, if you observe the covenant, if you are a nation of priests, if you are a holy people, then you know what's going to happen? You'll be a holy people. The Mamlechet Kohanim V'Goy Kadosh, the way it's represented over here, sounds like that's what will happen. If you behave a certain way, if you keep the covenant, if you understand this Torah, which is a guide, then the outcome will be, the benefit will be that you will be a holy people. Now, I'm giving you a way. That's my understanding. I'm giving you a path. Even the Ramban would agree, I think. It's not an end in itself because you can deviate from the path. But it is a path. It's a way to arrive at Mamlechet Kohanim V'Goy Kadosh. That I would say the Ramban would read it that way. This Torah, if you keep the covenant, if you follow my dictates, you have the possibility of becoming a Mamlechet Kohanim and a Goy Kadosh. This is what you should say to the children of Israel. But I emphasize this. It is presented as a choice. You have a choice. You cannot do it. That's the way God presents it. And again, this, the Meshech Chochmah, for example, Meir Simcha, he made the argument that when the Gemara says that God forced the Torah upon them, it's not that God actually forced it upon them. But given the fact that they had been the beneficiary of so many miracles and had seen God at the sea and experienced the 10 plagues, did they really have a choice? God's presence was so obvious. That's his claim. So therefore, it doesn't really mean they had no choice, but it means that, it wasn't a real choice in the sense they didn't see the option of saying no. Because the Gemara there in Shabbos, and it's actually relevant to yesterday we were Shabbos Mavarchim for Rosh Chodesh Adar. The Gemara, of course, famously says that at Sinai, did we accept the Torah? We accepted it, but it wasn't really a choice. when did we really accept the Torah, says the Gemara in Shabbos? On Purim. Because on Purim, God's presence was far from evident. Megillah and Esther doesn't even have God's name. God doesn't seem to be a player, not an obvious player in the Megillah. So that was the time, Kimu v'kibu HaYehudim, that the Jews accepted the Torah. I have a lot to say about that, but not now. Maybe we have a different class about Purim, I'll talk about that. But anyway, that is one understanding of this idea of holding the mountain over the people. But the question as to whether the Torah is something that's imposed upon you, there are no choices, it's imposed, or whether no, you have autonomy, you have the freedom to choose. That's a very, very basic question. Okay, before we continue, I'll just stop for a moment. Does anybody have any comments or questions?
Isn't the possibility of this is the Torah, but it's not even a question of acceptance. It's giving us the right or the obligation to keep learning and interpreting and finding out what Torah is saying.
I think that's certainly the rabbinic idea, is that we have an obligation to understand the Torah. And even more than that, you're raising a different question, which is a very basic question about how the rabbinic tradition understands the Torah herself, which is that the Torah is something that is ultimately in people's domain. We have the right, I would say the obligation to try to interpret the Torah so that the Torah is something which is living and that can address people in different generations. In other words, the question of Torah Sheba'al Peh, which is the Jewish tradition, Jewish rabbinic tradition. The claim is that on one hand, we are, of course, connected deeply to the Torah, to receiving the Torah to previous generations. At the same time, for the Torah to be a living document, it has to be able to address different situations or different ways of thinking that didn't exist prior, and that's up to the interpreters of the Torah to make those kind of decisions. I mean, I think when the Torah is really alive, that's what's happening. I mean, one of my goals has been to try to include more people in those kind of decisions, to give them the knowledge, I would say, and the understanding that they will be able to move the Jewish community forward as we encounter all kinds of new situations. My focus was largely, not entirely, more largely giving women the opportunity to make those decisions. It takes many years to learn. It can happen in 1 or 2 years. You commit to 10, 15 years of learning, get a group of people who can do that. But there's no question that within the rabbinic tradition, it's a Torah Sheba'al Peh. That's absolutely basic. But that doesn't come up so much at this point yet. It may come up, and maybe in a couple of minutes I'll address your point more thoroughly. But you're raising such a central point that would require there's a lot to say about that. But there's no question.
I'd like to suggest that maybe it came up when we said Na'aseh v'nishma.
That could be. The question is, what does nishma means? We will hopefully get to that. Not this week, but we will get to Na'aseh v'nishma is in chapter 24, by the way. Na'aseh is in chapter 19, and Na'aseh v'nishma is in chapter 24 that we'll get to. And the question is, what does nishma mean? That's really the central question. But these are all important questions. I will get to them. But I did want to address what you said just in a couple of minutes as we read through the chapter. There's something actually very important in chapter 19 that can be overlooked. Now, let me just read a little more verses, and we'll get to something. Yes.
What leads the Gemara to make this extreme statement?
I really don't know what it leads them. It's hard to know what it leads people to make statements. The idea that you are a commanded being, okay? The idea that you are a commanded being, and that you do, as I mentioned before, this is central to the thinking of Rabbi Soloveitchik, of Aaron Lichtenstein, of the Briskers in general. You do what you're commanded to do. Rabbi Lichtenstein, well, not so much he, but Rabbi Soloveitchik, on multiple occasions, Just yesterday, I had this conversation on multiple. The Rambam in his guide, the Rambam's Guide for the Perplexed. In the last book, there are 3 books. In book 3, it's just remarkable. He has an extended discussion of Tamei HaMitzvot. Are there reasons for the mitzvot? And the Rambam famously lays out, towards the very end of the guide, over the course of 15 or so chapters, he talks about the 14 different kinds of commandments. The Rambam's incredible. And then he gets into some of the details of particular commandments. And he makes, I just mentioned this yesterday. I want to mention this to everybody, that I was looking at the Rambam. The Rambam famously, of course, many of the prohibitions of the Torah, the Rambam relates to the prohibition to do idolatry. Even some of them that are not obviously connected to idolatry, the Rambam claims to have this knowledge of an ancient traditions that had certain idolatrous practices, and the Torah forbids them because they at one point were performed by idolatrous groups. That's the claim the Rambam makes. But yesterday I came across another statement of the Rambam towards the end of the guide, where he talks about other things, about why the genealogies in the Torah, why this, why that. And he makes the following incredible statement, which is, and this is from the man that wrote the Mishnah Torah. He collects all the laws. He doesn't think you don't observe the law. But the Rambam says, a lot of stuff in the Torah, we don't know why it's there, because we don't know enough about the ancient civilizations. And that's a remarkable statement, actually, because what he's really saying is that the Torah is responding to events of a particular time. Now, what happens when that doesn't exist anymore? So the mitzvot still exist, but from a logical standpoint, one could ask, why should they actually? So Rambam in his guide, it doesn't come through so much in the guide. He's explicit about this, which is rather remarkable. Rabbi Soloveitchik, who the connection of the briskets to the Rambam is famous, but he, on multiple occasions, disparaged this whole view of the Rambam of Tamei HaMitzvot. He didn't like it at all. And he made that clear on multiple occasions. The idea of giving reasons for the mitzvot, of rationale for the mitzvot, it's a basic question. The Brisker school, Rabbi Soloveitchik being part of it, they didn't go for that at all. No, forget the reasons. There are reasons. No doubt it's not that they agree. There probably are reasons, but the reason is never the basis of performance. The performance is because you are a commanded being. That's something so central. And as I mentioned, Shai Leibowitz, famously, he took this to an extreme, basically. But you have this deeply rooted in a lot of Jewish thinking. So you do it because you are a commanded being. And there's something to be said for that. I mean, I'm not going to get into what I think is not important here, but there's something to that you enter into something you take upon yourself. This is my God. I'm going to do what God commands me, maybe out of faith or whatever it is. But that's something, it's not just a statement. My point is, I chose one statement in the Gemara, but it's not just a statement in the Talmud. There's a whole philosophy built around this, about being a commanded being. Rabbi Lichtenstein famous said on many occasions, we don't ask, I don't want to get into the statement. I have a lot to say about this, but never ask why, he said, only ask what. He said this on multiple occasions. Don't ask why God commands something. Just ask, what is the nature of the command? Now, I think that's problematic for other reasons, but the point is, what I want everybody to understand is, if you didn't already, this is not a small detail. This is a way of thinking about Judaism. It's a way of thinking about Judaism, which is pretty basic. And Rabbi Soloveitchik, he's so open, he went to university, no. He's open about other things, but not about this. You are commanded, you do what you're told to do. Don't ask why. You do what you're told to do. You want to understand it. The nature of the command, that's one thing. But it's never, I do it because it makes sense. No. You do it because you are commanded. That is one point of view, pretty central point of view. And then, of course, there are many other points of view. So I just raised this. It's an opportunity when we're studying together the Chumash, sometimes to raise sort of very basic questions about our tradition. And what Tova raised is another very basic question: the nature of this kind of interpretive tradition, and that is central to our thinking as well. So I wanted to get to that here, and just want to point out one thing about chapter 19, which I think is very important. It's not always when we're studying together that we come across sort of basic ideas of Judaism within the study, within the text. But here you have this right here. So let me just read a few more verses, and I'll stop again and take more comments. It says, so Moshe is told to go to the people. Vayavo Moshe, Vayikra l'siknei ha'am, Vayasem l'fneihem et kol hadvarim ha'ela asher tzivahu Hashem. So Moshe goes and he speaks to the elders in verse number 7. What's curious is that in verse number 8, it says, Vayanu kol ha'am yachdav vayomru kol asher diber Hashem na'aseh. All the people, not just the elders, but the entire people, all the people said together, Yachdav, whatever God says, Na'aseh, we will do. Here it says Na'aseh. In chapter 24, it's Na'aseh v'nishma. Then we'll leave that for chapter 24. Vayoshev Moshe divrei ha'amel Hashem. Now Moshe goes back up and speaks to God. Moshe is the middleman here. Tell the people this, speaks to the people, they give their answer. Moshe goes back to God. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe. Hidei Anochi bo elecha bi'av he'onon. Ba'avur yishma'om b'dabri imach, v'gam b'cho yaminu li'olam. Vayaged Moshe et divrei ha'am el Hashem. This is a strange verse. Let me get to the first part first. God said to Moshe, behold, I will appear to you, bi'av he'onon, the thickness of a cloud. Av, the word Av can mean a cloud, and Anan can mean a cloud. It means a cloud, cloudy cloud. I will appear to you in a cloud. Why? In order that the people hear me speaking to you, and they will believe in you forever. Then we have the strange ending, Vayaged Moshe divrei ha'amel Hashem, and Moshe told God what the people had said, which is a very strange thing because it already says in verse number 8, Vayoshev Moshe divrei ha'amel Hashem. So what did Moshe tell God in verse number 9 that Moshe had already not told God in verse number 8? We'll leave that out for now. But I want to make a different point. What is the purpose? What is this whole purpose of Sinai, of God appearing at Mount Sinai, of this revelation? And here we come to the most basic question. But what's clear, I think, is that one of the purposes of this event in Sinai, God says it explicitly, the people will hear me speaking to you. In other words, the people will hear God's voice. So one important point is there will be some kind of revelation that the people will experience. The nature of that revelation, what exactly the people are hearing, is a huge dispute among the commentaries that we will touch upon and we will discuss. We'll leave that out for now. I want to focus on the second thing God says. V'gam b'cha yaminu li'olam, and they will believe in you forever. In other words, one of the purposes of Sinai seems to be to give Moshe standing with the people, that the people will believe in Moshe. And now the question has to be raised, what do you mean the people will believe in Moshe? Didn't the people already believe in Moshe? It's true that Moshe says to God, in the episode of the snare, Lo yaminu, they're not going to believe in me. But on two different occasions, the Torah said that people did believe. First of all, when Moshe goes back to the people and tells the people that God is going to redeem them, it says that the people actually believed. Let's find that verse. That's in chapter, I believe it's in chapter 4. Let me see. Let's see, chapter 4, I believe it is. The end of chapter 4. I'll just read it to you. Moshe goes with Aaron. Aaron has joined Moshe, Vayasfu, it calls the Bnei Yisrael, chapter 4, verse 29. He gathered all the elders. Vayidaber Aaron, and Aaron said all the words that he was supposed to say. He's Moshe's spokesperson. He performed the signs before the people. The last verse of chapter 4, Vayamein Am. The people believed that God was to deliver them from bondage. God had seen their suffering. They bowed down. But more than that, at the splitting of the sea, a verse we're probably very familiar with, just before the song of the sea, by Yosha Hashem, we say this in the morning prayers. By Yosha Hashem, in end of chapter 14, verses familiar to most of us probably. By Yosha Hashem, by Yom Mahu Yisrael B'Yad Mitzrayim, by Yar Yisrael Mitzrayim Meit Al Sfat Hayam, by Yar Yisrael Hayod Hagdolah Shoasah Hashem Mitzrayim. The people saw the great hand of God, what God had done against Egypt. Vayiruam et Hashem, and the people feared God. Vayaminu b'Hashem u'v'Moshe Avdo. They believed in God and in Moses, his servant. Black on white, chapter 14, verse number 31. The last verse of chapter 14. Vayaminu b'Hashem u'v'Moshe Avdo. So what does it mean over here? I'm going to appear to you before the people. They will hear me speaking to you. So they'll believe that God speaks to the human. And the Gabbachoya Aminu Le'olam, and they will believe in you forever. Of course, one could distinguish in two different ways. One could distinguish by saying here God emphasizes Le'olam. They'll always have faith in you. They have faith in you now. They had faith at the sea, but that faith could waver. But God says, no, they're going to believe in you forever. That's one possibility. But I think there's actually something much deeper over here. And this addresses the point that Tova was making earlier, which is, it's one thing to have faith in Moses as a leader. Moses took them out of Egypt. He's Moshe. He's the one who draws out. They're coming to the sea. They see the Egyptians defeated at the sea. They're free from Mitzrayim. They believe in God and in Moses, his servant. But this is different over here. The emunah in Moshe is not the emunah of the leader. Not Moses as a leader, not Moses who takes them out of Egypt, but Moses as a lawgiver. That Moshe is one who can bring the word of God to the people, and Moses is one perhaps who can interpret the God of word for the people. So what Moshe said earlier when he spoke to Yitro, why are you sitting by yourself? That makes no sense. You need a lot of help. What choice do I have, says Moshe? I'm the one who could bring the matters to God. So here, the point is, I'm going to speak to you. The people are going to hear me giving laws, the 10 Commandments. Right? But after the 10 Commandments, the people say to Moshe, we don't want to hear God's voice anymore. We're afraid. Moshe, you tell us. You go to God. You bring the instruction. So the idea that the human being can be one who mediates God's instruction, that's what's over here. That's the great significance. And the rabbinic tradition, the idea of Torah Sheba'al Peh, the idea of the human being as the interpreter of God's word, that's something which is very central. And this verse makes that pretty clear. The purpose is not just about me, says God. The purpose, faith in you as a teacher, not as a leader, but as a teacher. So again, I'll tell you one story. And then I'll stop, take any other comments or questions, then we'll continue. Many years ago, I don't know if you remember this or not, many years ago, I don't know how many years it was, it had to be between 25 and 30 years ago. I got a call from a fellow who had connections to the State Department. And he said to me that he's bringing these Muslim leaders, these emirs, the world's experts on Islamic law. He's bringing them to the States, to different places. And he wants to bring them to Drisha, to have some kind of, they can speak at Drisha, and a Jewish presence. Maybe someone can respond to them. How is that? Is that okay with you? I said, fine. You bring them, and I'll find you a translator too. You know, a woman from Israel who was a translator of Arabic. So they came. I don't know if any of you remember this at all. They came to Drisha on 65th Street at the time. And there were, I don't know, maybe 10 or so of these emirs from Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the world leaders, actually. And there were, in addition to that, 3 people from the Egyptian consulate. One was the head of the consulate in Washington, and there were 2 women. They're all men there, except for these 2 women from the consulate. A couple of Drisha women were there. And I sat at the head of the thing. To my right sat the Egyptian ambassador. And the emirs were talking. Each one is talking about the Quran, it's egalitarian, it's this, it's that. And I realized that they're all not even speaking to me. They're talking to each other. Who is going to be the most strictly religious of them, They go all around the room and say all kinds of stuff. Anyway, then it came to me. Here's what I said. I said, you know something? These are ancient texts. I don't know much about the Quran, but the Bible is an ancient text, 3,000 years old. I don't expect that a 3,000-year-old text will necessarily reflect all of my thinking. There are many things you read in the Torah, many, many things, that don't reflect, personally, the way I think about the world. I wouldn't expect it otherwise. The issue is not what it says in the Torah. The issue is who's interpreting the Torah. Who's actually engaged in Torah Shebaal Peh? Who are the people that are interpreting the Torah so that the Torah is a living, on one hand, with deep respect for and connection to the Torah. On the other hand, understand the Torah has to be interpreted in such a way that continues to guide us. Who's doing the interpreting, my friends? That's what matters. At which point, by the way, the guy sitting to my right, the Egyptian ambassador, leaned over to me and said, listen, here's my card. You're the only guy in the room who actually speaks the truth. I remember that very well. And I think what I said then is true today. It's all about who is interpreting. And that's exactly the point over here. It's not about God's voice, because there are times when God's voice can't be heard at all. That's the point of the Gemara in Shabbos. Megillah Esther, there's no God's voice. Maybe there is, but you have to be attuned to hear it. So the interpreters are what is important over here, and that's what God says to Moshe, not just faith in you as a person, faith as a teacher. That's the idea of Torah Shebaal Peh, and that the rabbinic tradition picks up and runs with. Now, again, people can disagree, of course. No 2 people agree on everything. There are people that believe you have to move things at a certain pace, more slowly, more conservative, more progressive, more liberal. That's why we have a Gemara, a Talmud, and disputes. But the idea of the Torah Shebaal Peh in this verse, in chapter 19, to me is very central. Okay, before we continue, any other comments or questions? Then we'll move forward over here. There's no doubt these are central texts for our religion. There's no question about that.
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Laszlo, and then a question from chat.
Go ahead. I can't hear anything. Is someone speaking?
Go ahead. I will go after you.
Okay. Then just something from Stacy Lehman asked a little earlier.
Yes.
I know you don't want to get into it, but she would love to hear some of Rabbi Silber's thoughts on Ta'amei Mitzvot. Stacy, did I get that right?
Ta'amei Mitzvot?
Yep.
It's, again, right. I didn't want to get into it. Not because it's not important. I mean, what I personally think about it is not, I don't think it's very important, but I mean, I think that the Rambam writes at length about Ta'amei Mitzvot. I think that the issue is, I personally am a big believer in Ta'amei Mitzvot. I think that it's part of saying the Torah has to speak. You have to understand where it's coming from, what it's trying to do, and how it would apply to the present situation. I'll give you an example of this. I'm reluctant to even say a word about this, because when I start talking about it, it opens up a floodgate of. But I would say the following: one of the people that is actually a very interesting thinker, I don't know if he's read that much nowadays, it was Eliezer Berkowitz. Eliezer Berkowitz, very interesting. And these kind of people, certainly in the States, are sorely missing, by the way, this kind of thinking. which is deeply rooted in our tradition, but also is understands the world and is willing to put forward ideas which are not necessarily, he's a thinking person. And he raises the following question. He makes the following point. The point that he makes is that take something like a Shemitah, the seventh year. Now, outside Israel, the seventh year is pretty much like every other year. People don't pay that much attention to, but in Israel, it's a big deal. Can't work the fields. How does that work? If you produce crops, you're going to lose your market share, etc., etc., etc. And there were different approaches to Shemitah nowadays. Famously, Rav Kook, with the Heter Mechira, fundamentally he undercut Shemitah altogether. You sell the lands; it's not really your land. So his approach was fundamentally there actually is no Shemitah. And what Rabbi Berkowitz writes about in his book, among many other things, is this. Let's say we're not observing Shemitah for whatever reason, rightly or wrongly, I'm not getting into that. But let's say it can't be observed today. But his point is, well, what is the idea of Shemitah? What is the idea of Shemitah? And one idea of Shemitah is in the seventh year, all the lands, all the poor people can go enter into any field and they can eat the crops. Because there is no ownership. Every seventh year, in a sense, the fields are what we call hefker. So therefore, the seventh year is about giving people and animals access to all the lands that are producing food. And his point is, okay, if we're not observing Shemitah, well, what about this idea of every periodically making it clear that everybody is entitled to be able to survive in this world and to have enough food for themselves. There's enough food in the world to feed everybody multiple times over. It's the way it gets distributed. And his point is, if we're not going to observe Shemitah for whatever reason, but let's at least take the idea of Shemitah. Let's think about what Shemitah really is about, and let's put that into practice. Now that's I give it as an example of what I'm talking about Tamei HaMitzvot. Because what he's saying is, he is working with Tamei HaMitzvot. What is the idea behind it? And then let's apply it. Okay, for whatever reason, it doesn't apply today, but the idea can apply today. So I think that I very much believe in that approach. I think that the Torah is something that Torah is a living document. Yes, there are some things in the Torah that our thinking is utterly different, the way we see other people, etc., etc. And you have to wrestle with that. But I mean, there's plenty in the Torah that we actually do believe in. We feel we should believe it. We don't put it into practice. And that's an example, I think, where Tamei HaMitzvot can be very helpful. So this is a big question, though. How that's so as far as that. I see another question. How will the Karaites deal with this verse? Let me just make a point about the Karaites, by the way, which is another fascinating subject. Yes, the Karaites on one hand say you have to stick to what the Torah seems to be saying. So they reject rabbinic interpretation. But in point of fact, the Karaites have their own interpretations. In other words, even the Karaites have their own interpretations and their own disagreements. It's not that they have no Torah Shebaal Peh. They don't have our Torah Shebaal Peh, but they have their own Torah Shebaal Peh. So it's the Karaites are actually fascinating, and it would be worthwhile for Drisha to do some work with the Karaites because they are important in their own, and they had enormous influence on the thinking of the rabbinites and the interpreters of the Torah. The Ibn Ezra, for example, was tremendously influenced by the Karaites, even though he attacks them all the time. But he also was influenced them in a positive sense. But anyway, these are big issues. Okay, let me yes. Anybody else? One last comment there? Who else had a comment? That's it. Laszlo, you want to say something?
Well, it's not that important, and you have little time. And I just wanted to say, without undermining the point that you made, but there's also, when you speak about belief, there's a difference between belief in the kind of abstract emotional sense And now you have to believe and do something as a result, or to avoid doing things as a result. It becomes a more thoroughgoing test of belief.
No, the idea of right. I mean, the idea of, I mean, there's a lot of different pieces of this over here. The idea of seeing oneself as a commanded being, I very much do believe in that personally. I think that's really important. That you're put on earth to serve in some way. That everybody has a mission. Try to figure out what the mission is, and that there's a purpose to our existence. That I do believe, and I believe that's central to my thinking, and I think to Jewish thinking. Everybody has a mission, and everybody has a different mission, and we don't always know what our mission is. So I think that's true. And then once you're committed to the mission, it entails all kinds of sacrifices, and you have to be willing to make those sacrifices. That's certainly true in the Chumash. I mean, the Chumash, the covenant of the Torah, and we'll talk more about this, is about you pay this enormous price for entering into the covenant. Gerut, Avdut, and Ini, we spoke about this multiple times. So that part is certainly the case. It doesn't make it easier, I don't think. And in a certain sense, it makes it even more difficult, because if once you understand what the Torah is trying to get at, then maybe there are other ways to arrive at your destination. You have to try to figure out other ways to arrive at the destination. So I don't think this makes life simpler in a way, or easier. In a certain sense, it makes it even more difficult. Once you see you have a particular mission, and that's what you got to do, and whatever the cost and the sacrifice, you have to do that. Okay, let's continue with this. Again, these are texts that raise a million questions because they're so basic. And okay, I'm going to make one other point about a verse that we read, and that is when God speaks to Moshe in verse number 5. And now, v'yatoim shemoah tishmu b'koli ushmartem et briti, and you obey my covenant, you keep my covenant. And here's the point I wanted to make about this verse. We have a few minutes. I want to make the following point about this entire episode of Mount Sinai, Kabbalat Torah. Let me just say now, and we'll continue this next time, that there, I think, are three main purposes over here that the Torah puts forward, three main elements of the revelation of Sinai. One is the idea of actual revelation, and we'll talk about this next week. In other words, the idea that God is revealed in this world. The idea that the people, in some sense, and we'll discuss this in various commentaries, read the text differently, but bottom line is that the people standing at Sinai are in some sense experiencing God, whether they understand all the 10 commandments, whether it's just 2 commandments, whether they hear noise but no content, whatever it is. But the idea that God can be revealed in this world, and God can be seen as present in this world, that's very basic to this event. And that the revelation, and that's what the medieval philosophers picked up, is not just to a single person. Even if you believe that God speaks to Moshe, okay, and Moshe is hearing everything and telling the people, but the people still are, as God says, they will see me speaking to you. So the idea of revelation is something very central in our presentation of of Sinai. And as we'll see, hopefully either next week or the week after, it also this whole event of Sinai is once again mentioned in the book of Dvarim. There's a retelling and a different telling of the revelation in Devarim, chapter 5, chapters 4 and 5. So what is revelation? One is the content. This is not just a revelation like at the sea, where God is seen at the sea, God destroys the Egyptian army and all that. But the revelation of Sinai is a revelation of actual content. There are 10 commandments, or 10 dibrot, whether they're actually all commandments, that doesn't matter. But there's a content over here, and there's a content beginning in end of chapter 20, chapter 21 of Mishpatim. You know, if my ox damages your ox, I got to pay X amount. it's very, very practical, a lot of it. There's a mixture of laws that involve human beings with each other. There's laws between ourselves and God. It's all part of one system. We don't separate them. It's both. The revelation has both, but it's a revelation which has a content to it. That's point number 2. And point number 3, and this is a very important point, that actually it's not just about the content and it's not just about the revelation. It's about a covenant. Sinai is a covenant. The tablets are called Shnei Luchot Habrit. And actually, it's interesting that over here, God says to Moshe, if you will hear my voice and keep my covenant. Now, which covenant is God talking about? That's the question. One possibility is keep the covenant means the covenant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the covenant of the matriarchs back in the book of Breshit. You have to adhere to the covenant. That's one possibility. Or no, if you hear my voice and keep my covenant means this covenant, that the 10 Commandments and all that follows, the Torah in general, is a covenant. As I said, the tablets are called Shnei Luchot Habrit, the tablets of the covenant. So there are 3 different elements to this Sinai revelation. There's the revelation piece, there's the content, what is spoken, and there is the covenant. And I emphasize the covenant, which is about relationship. Because the truth of the matter is that content and covenant are not exactly the same thing. I mean, they're related, but they're very different. In other words, do you see yourself as, here I think is where perhaps the Hasidim, the real Hasidus, and the real Misnagdim, they differ. Strikes me that there's a different focus. That for the Misnagdim, it's all about it's about the Torah. People I know speak very little about God, actually. Don't talk about God at all. From Jews don't talk much about God that I know. They talk about the Torah, talk about obedience to God's word. That is for sure. But it's not about a personal relationship. In the Hasidic world, it's much more about a personal relationship. When Rav Nachman talks about prayer, it's a personal. God, you talk to God, you're actually talking to God. It's supposed to do, you're talking to God directly. And that's very different, actually. So there is, the reason I mentioned this idea of this personal relationship is because what happens in this book, when we're standing at Sinai, we're waiting for Moses to return, and we make a golden calf. And the sin of the golden calf is not just about idolatry, which is obviously it's out of bounds completely, but it's not just a sin of idolatry, but it's a sin of idolatry at the moment that we're about to receive the tablets of the covenant. In other words, it's a breaking of the covenant. It's a personal affront. That's why the sin of the golden calf is so powerful. It's a rupture in the relationship, which has it's such that I didn't keep a law. It's a personal offense. And that's the idea of covenant. So there are 3 different dimensions to receiving the Torah. As I mentioned, there's revelation, God is present, there's the context, there's the laws, the rules, God's Torah. Then there's the personal piece. And different people, different groups emphasize one over the other. But this idea that it's we have a personal connection to God, that in the world of the Litvaks and the Misnagdim, you don't really see much of that. You have it in some Hasidic circles, though. In any event, these are the issues that emerge from our study of Sinai, the 10 Commandments, and the Mishpatim. Obviously, it's a big topic, but I think it's an opportunity to think really about sort of the basics, about what is this religion all about. And here we have the great revelation, the public revelation of God, not just individuals, but to the general community. Hey, I'll stop at this point. We'll continue with this next week. We'll get to the 10 Commandments, and looking forward. If anybody has any other comments or questions, you can always email me, dsilber@drisha.org. Looking forward and to continue to study this. Thank you very much.
A couple questions came up in chat, but I just want to highlight one from Stacy Lehman asking recommendations for writing by Eliezer Berkovitz.
Yeah, there's a book by Eliezer Berkowitz. It's called Not in Heaven. Not in Heaven. That's the book I'm familiar with. It's a worthwhile book. He's very interesting in general. Not in Heaven, Eliezer Berkowitz. Yeah. Okay. Anything else?
Earlier question from Jack Wasserman asking for Karaite interpretation of Exodus 19:3.
I don't know. I don't know. There's a ton of stuff. These of the Karaites, though. There's a world of scholarship about the Karaites. A fellow named Nimoy, Nemoy, famously wrote about the Karaites. There's a whole world. There's a whole world. I don't know specifically about. Maybe I'll take a look about this particular verse, but there's a world. There's Anan. There's Kirkasani is very important. Kirkasani is very central. There's a whole. It's a world, and world which was at one point in Jewish history pretty central. Pretty central. They lived in Jerusalem. I forget what it's called. Something Zion. The group of Zion there, and they had enormous influence on some of the interpreters of the Torah, including the Ibn Ezra. They themselves were influenced by the great Arabic philosophers. The Arabs were the great intellectuals of the world for a couple of centuries, a long time ago. But they had an influence. They would study the Quran, and they had an influence on the Karaites, who in turn had an influence on many of the Jewish thinkers and interpreters. But it's a big topic. It's very interesting.
Just to add, Hitler did not consider them Jews and therefore did not persecute them.
That is true. There was a whole discussion about that. They were able to get out of that somehow, and they presented themselves as non-Jews. But this you're talking about 80 years ago. I'm talking about 1,200 years ago. The whole history of it. Anyway, but they're very interesting. The early Karaites are extremely interesting and very important really made tremendous contributions to understanding of the Torah, even when we disagree with them. But the kinds of questions they raise about how, kind of literary questions, they're very avant-garde, very ahead of their time. Let me stop at this point then, and I wish you all a good day.
Thank you, Rabbi
so much.
Silber.
Okay.
Adarabah. And thank you, Gail.
everyone. Thank you, everyone. For information about this and other upcoming Drisha classes, you can check out our website at drisha.org/classes. I hope to see you all next week. Take care and have a good day.